Hello, test 1, 2, 3. How are we doing? Test 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Right, no, I was told and I read the sign.
All right, testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2.
Hello? Hello? Am I good? Okay, I'll keep talking here.
Hi there, testing, testing. Does this work?
Testing 1, 2, 3, check. 1, 2. Testing 1, 2.
Man, that sounded professional. That was really professional. Is this good?
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2. Good evening, everyone. Testing 1, 2.
Yeah.
The most fashionable rabbi in Kansas City.
Tom hasn't known me that long, and he knows this a bunch of. Good evening, everybody. I'm Rabbi Doug Alpert of Congregation Kol Ami, and it is my honor to offer the opening prayer for this important program presented by First Call. And first, I offer a prayer of gratitude for First Call. Gratitude and thanks, certainly for presenting this program on faith and addiction. Gratitude for all First Call does to address substance use disorder, to help those who suffer from it, to help those who have loved ones suffering from substance use disorder, and gratitude to First Call for leading the way in destigmatizing substance use disorder. That, like all mental illness, substance use disorder is an illness, and that through the work of First Call, I pray that we all come to understand that substance use disorder is an illness and is not a character flaw. I offer this prayer to the families and other loved ones who seek to offer support to those who suffer from substance use disorder, prayers of strength and love. Certainly none of us like to see our loved ones suffer. May you all gain strength from a community of support, organizations like First Call and others who care for and about you. And finally, and of greatest importance, I offer prayers of love and support to all those who suffer from substance use disorder. May those not yet in recovery find the strength and support to begin that journey. May those in recovery know that while the journey is never completed, I pray for you that each day will be better than the last. And I conclude this prayer with a traditional blessing of healing. May the one who blessed our ancestors give blessing and healing to all who suffer from substance use disorder. May they find complete healing, a healing of both body and spirit. Baruch atah Adonai Rofei HaCholim. Blessed is God who heals all who suffer illness. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation. As Rabbi was praying, it dawned upon me that this is a conversation that's been long overdue. Many of us in the faith community serve individuals every single day and may not recognize that that's a person that is suffering from this disease. What brings us all together tonight is a conversation that took place between a person and their pastor. And in that conversation, there was, I want some information, some verbiage that I can use for a sermon. And you can imagine the excitement that maybe ensued from that conversation about this subject matter being brought up in a sermon. Well, this person tuned in and was able to hear the sermon that was preached. However, the information that came from the pulpit that day was disheartening, and information was full of misinformation. And so it sparked something in this individual, and conversation started from that. And as a result, here we are. The purpose here tonight is to dispel some rumors, to address some misinformation, and hopefully to give some inclusive language around this topic of addiction and recovery that will be helpful for all faith leaders in whatever your faith tradition is. With that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists, who will be our distinguished guests tonight, addressing some of your questions, as well as some questions that we have for them. And by the way, if you are listening in on YouTube or Facebook Live, we hope that you will interact with us with your questions and with your comments so that we can make this conversation as in-depth as possible. To my immediate left is the Reverend Michael Brooks. To his left is Pastor Sarah. And to his left is Rabbi Glickman, and to his left is Pastor Victor Daughtery, and to his left, our final panelist to the far left is Pastor Tom Langenhofer. And as we go forward with comments and questions for tonight's discussion, please feel free to interact with us on YouTube and Facebook Live. At this time, I will start with our farthest panelists and give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves and share anything that you'd like that brings you to this conversation tonight.
The least well-dressed of the group up here started from the least to the best dressed. Well, yeah, hi, everybody. I am Tom Langhofer, and I serve as pastor of Recovery Ministries here at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. I'm really honored to be here. I am a person in long-term recovery from an alcohol addiction. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I'm a person that drank socially for a lot of years through college and into my business career, and over the course of time, it got the best of me to where I was drinking every day, throughout the day, a quart of vodka a day, and I had a mental breakdown, was in the hospital, sobered up for 30 days and decided I had it under control, and went back out and started drinking again. And of course, for those of us that are in recovery, usually when you do it again, well, I shouldn't say usually, I think every time if you do it again, it's worse. And that was the case for me. So I finally hit that bottom. I reached out for help, because the first time I tried to do it alone, I reached out for help, and I found help through the halls of AA. Actually, I found the help through a pastor here at this church, and he didn't know what to do with me. And I learned at that time most pastors really didn't know what to do with people that were suffering from addiction. But he led me to somebody that did, and that's somebody in AA, and that's where I sobered up. And had a spiritual awakening in the halls of AA, which I found interesting that I had an awakening there as opposed to in church. But that awakening was that God was telling me to help. My job was to help others find sobriety through God. And I ultimately retired from my business career, went into seminary, and became a pastor. So that's my calling, is to help people find sobriety. And I just love what I'm doing. So, thank you.
Thank you. And again, like Tom, I want to thank everyone for this opportunity to come together and share some really beautiful perspectives on this process, and hopefully to help a lot of folks. My name is Victor Daughtery. I'm the director of the Temple Buddhist Center, which is located inside of Unity Temple in the Plaza. And also as recovering from a narcotics addiction, having spent much of my life in various musical situations, as many folks know, as a musician and artist, that kind of a lifestyle can lead very much to many different forms of addiction. And so when everything fell apart for me, it was kind of a free fall. And I remember picking up a book, just grasping at anything, at something that could feel real, that could give me some sense of a solidity. And the book that I picked up was a book called Buddhism is Not What You Think. And as I began seeing a therapist, he said, I recommend that you see a friend of mine who was at the time the founder of the Temple Buddhist Center. And through my practice and through meditation and through mindfulness, I was able to really get to the root of my suffering that it was so important to try to numb out to, that it became so critical to try to escape from through any form of seeking, addictions, sex and love addictions, any of these types of things which were designed to get away from the suffering, I was able to get to the root of it, to realize the fear within me that was causing this craving and this need that was just never satisfied. And so because of that, my practice, I've been practicing over 20 years now, and am now able to repay the incredible kindnesses from the community and from my teacher and the teachings by being able to carry those forward and offer those to others now, which is the greatest gift I could ever ask for and the only real way to repay it. So again, thank you for allowing me to share some of those perspectives and thoughts and history with you.
Thanks, Victor. I'm David Glickman. I'm the senior rabbi at Congregation Beth Shalom, and we're a synagogue here in Overland Park at 143rd and Lamar. And my experience with substance use disorder is because I lost my brother Daniel, my little brother, to a heroin addiction 15 years ago, a little over 15 years ago now. And I was 32 and he was 28. And during the course of his active addiction and his times of both sobriety and also times when he had difficulties and setbacks, there were times when I found help with other rabbis and in Jewish settings, but oftentimes I found myself alone in Jewish settings. And more often than that, when I had the opportunity to participate in Al-Anon, both in Israel and here in the United States. And when I was in Israel and I was in a Jewish setting, the 12-step world made a lot of sense. But what I found here in the States, in 12-step rooms that were primarily Christian, while it's nothing against Christianity or against my Christian neighbors, for a Jewish person, it was very lonely. And so a part of my rabbinate over the last 20 years has been through private counseling and meetings to help Jewish families translate the wisdom of the 12-step world and finding the compatibilities with Judaism and the 12 steps.
Thank you. And again, I want to echo the others up here who have said thank you for welcoming us and for allowing us to participate in this evening. My name is Sarah Pierce. I'm the synodically authorized minister at All Saints Lutheran Church in Blue Springs. And when I got the phone call inviting me to be a part of this panel, my response was, well, I'm not really sure if I'm what you're looking for. And I said, I'm new to ministry. I'm not yet ordained. New to ministry, don't have a whole lot of experience interacting with parishioners who have had substance abuse disorder. But then I started reflecting and talking about my background as a nurse and working in the hospital, taking care of folks at the bedside who are withdrawing. And moving into care management is what I do full-time, and then ministry is kind of the side gig. Not the side gig, but the part-time deal. But now I work in care management, and some of the folks who report up to me are nurses and social workers who deal directly day to day with folks in the community who have no insurance and who have behavioral health issues. And I think that we all are kind of familiar of that confluence of behavioral health disorders and substance abuse disorder. And so they see a lot of that. And I have a social worker who's in my office pretty regularly, just ranting and railing against the way that people who are in the hospital are just chronically undertreated when they're withdrawing. And so I thought, boy, I do kind of have a story to tell here, don't I? So that's my perspective coming into this. And again, thank you all for having me up here with you.
Let me also thank First Call for this invitation. It certainly has been a long time coming. I've been pastoring here in Kansas City for 21 years with this substance use disorder background and hoping that the church would finally get it right. I was born and raised right here in Kansas City. My path through substance use and abuse started in high school, where I started getting high and drunk because college scholarships flew out the window once I got hurt and couldn't play basketball my senior year, and so a downward spiral began until I decided to go into the Air Force, and the Air Force really what saved my life and got me off the streets of Kansas City. But then also while in the Air Force, I got the opportunity to cross-train to become actually a substance abuse counselor. That's what they called it. What they called is drug and alcohol counselors here. So been a drug and alcohol counselor, been a substance abuse counselor, been an addiction counselor, and I'm not sure what they're called now, whatever the current vernacular is. That path brought me back here to Kansas City. Long story short, I came back and started working at Swope Health Services in the homeless department, where I got to see addiction firsthand, right up front in your face with what's going on in the streets of Kansas City. And the sad reality is 21 years later, not a whole lot has changed. And so I'm hoping this panel, this new approach to addiction will give some people better insight, and we can find some better solutions on how we solve problems in Kansas City. Oh, and I'm currently now the pastor of the Oasis Church, formerly known as Zion Grove Baptist Church here in Kansas City.
All right, you have heard from our panelists, a very distinguished group of faith leaders in our community, and we are ready to begin this conversation. But let me share just a little bit about my story. I got into this field of substance use disorder many years ago, and one of the reasons was that I had an older sister who was an alcoholic and suffered with this disease for a long time. Gratefully, she got into recovery and has more than 30 years of recovery now. But just to show how this is a hereditary disease, one of her daughters also suffers from addiction, and in and out of treatment centers and even in and out of jail. And so this conversation is personal. It sounds to each one of us in our own way. I am Darren Faulkner, Pastor Darren Faulkner, and I am the founding principal of the Faith Defenders Bible Institute right here in Kansas City. I saw a quote that I want to begin our discussion tonight with that I think is pretty relevant. And the quote just simply says, "Addiction is giving up everything for one thing, but recovery is giving up one thing for everything." I thought that was very profound. And with that, let's begin our conversation. We have different faith traditions represented on the panel, and I'd like to just put this out to the group. In your faith tradition, is addiction viewed as a disease? We've talked about, some of you have mentioned that as a disease in your opening statements, but is in your faith tradition, in whole or in part, addiction viewed as a disease? And anyone that would like to take that question?
I'll start. So I'm traditionally a Black Baptist preacher, so trying to get rid of the Baptist tag. So we're not a denominational church now. We've been delivered. But I would say not commonly. I think those who have had experience with substance use disorder understand it, but the real reality is most of us have gone through years of training with no education whatsoever on how to deal with this. So I would say for those who've had experience with it, or those who've had family members, they understand better. But as a general rule, I wouldn't say that in the Baptist tradition it's commonly known as a disease.
I think I would echo that in the Lutheran tradition. I think that that's also the case, that it's not commonly recognized as a disease. But I do think, I hope anyway, that that's starting to change. Some of the courses, there were a couple of courses that were offered. I'm just getting ready to graduate from seminary, actually, here in about a month. And some of the courses that I had the opportunity to take would have dealt with substance use disorder and mental health problems and that sort of thing. So I think that that's starting to change in the Lutheran tradition.
I would say that in the Jewish tradition, though the word disease or disorder isn't specifically used all the time, I think for many centuries we've had an understanding that sometimes there are forces that are beyond our control, and so that they have no judgment attached to them, in the same way that we look at diseases in the modern day. And actually, one of the great pioneers in recent years in the Jewish community has been Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, who passed away this past year. And he was the medical director of the Gateways Center in Pittsburgh. And he was a Hasidic rabbi as well as an MD psychiatrist who spent his entire professional life dealing with addiction and substance use disorder. And I think that his pioneering work in the last 20 to 30 years especially really took away a lot of the stigma, but only for those people who knew his work. And unfortunately, substance use disorder, like so many other ailments that people have, we don't learn about it until it affects us personally.
Thank you, Rabbi David. In the Buddhist tradition, it is definitely, to answer your question directly, yes, it is considered a disease. And perhaps in some discussions, perhaps even a symptom of a disease. In the Buddhist tradition, one of the things we try to do is to, for example, in Vipassana or in insight meditation, getting still and getting quiet, we begin to observe the nature of our mind, begin to realize where, one person can be, for various reasons, perhaps very self-loathing, self-hatred, or perhaps needing to control a situation depending on our families of origin, depending on our upbringing, our environment, our surroundings. This disease is very, very complex, and there is no one, straight answer for any of it, but one possible path. And this is important, in my opinion, to stress, is there are so many possibilities, and many folks get disheartened and discouraged after only trying one or two possible ways to find relief, to find recovery. And so in the Buddhist practice, getting at that root cause of the suffering, because when there is no more suffering, then there's no need to try to escape. There's no more need to numb out. There's no more need to try to solve, cure, fix something as you come to realize the truth of who you are, and that this realization that these are things that just arise from conditioned patterns of speech and behavior all of your life. So it's kind of an unlearning and yet a realization of who you truly are. And that can be a wonderful way for some folks to really come to terms with what's going on.
Yeah, I guess I'll just kind of echo what most everybody said here. I don't know about the United Methodist denomination as a whole, but at Church of the Resurrection, I think a lot of people understand it as a disease, but they don't understand. They see it as a disease, but it's a misunderstood disease. And I think people assume that it's curable, which it's chronic, so there's no cure. And as we say, it's cunning, powerful, and baffling. And I think that's how a lot of people see it in our congregation. I think we try to treat it with grace and mercy, but there are people that I think see it as a moral downfall, moral character issue, and simply they're not praying enough, they're not connected enough with God. And so that's some education that we're trying to do, and I think this event today will help that a lot.
Thank you, panelists, for your responses. Just a follow-up question to that initial question. Some of the faith traditions on the panel do view it as a disease, but may not have the full understanding of what that means. How do we as faith leaders help those in our congregations and in our communities better understand this thing as a disease? What are the things that we can do, aside from what we're doing tonight, in our faith communities, how do we help them better understand the disease of addiction? Pastor Sarah, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think the first step is just being proactive. When you hear someone saying this is a moral issue or saying this is a personal failing or a personality issue or something, to push back against that and say, no, this is a disease. It's chemically caused or whatever, with whatever's going on in the brain, but it's a disease. It's not a moral failing. And then I think to offer education and to be deliberate about not just in the moment, not just what I think of in my head as just-in-time education, but also to think about what can we schedule over the course of the year for educational events, whether it's adult education or whatever the case may be, or a Tuesday night class or something like that. How can we address that? And then I think maybe option 3 is from the pulpit. But I think that the best learning is going to happen in those one-on-one and small group conversations rather than what we say from the pulpit.
Excellent response. Take one other response to that question.
I think it starts with just seeing people as people and not as damaged goods. I think that whole moral piece, I think, is where the church has missed it for a long time. And really what I'm learning and getting much more education on is learning how to deal with people that have been traumatized, because it's the substance use is a symptom of the real problem. We see it as the problem because that's what society keeps telling us. It's the drugs, it's the alcohol, it's the acid, it's the methamphetamine, but all that is just a symptom of what's really going on with a person. And until you get to what's really going on with the person, they're going to keep on using those things, because the reality is drugs and alcohol work, y'all. If I'm feeling a certain way and I want to escape it, if I get high, guess what? I escape it. If I'm feeling a certain way and I don't want to feel it, if I get drunk, I don't feel it anymore. So we're not going to take away the fact that drugs and alcohol work. So what can we give people that's going to work to help them deal with the trauma outside of the drugs and the alcohol? And that's where the church, I think, needs to start focusing on. Not this person has been on a binge, not what drug they've been doing, not how long they've been doing it, not all the stuff that we end up talking about that has nothing to do with getting the person healed. But see them as people that just need to be healed. I think that's where the church can start. Seeing them as just people that need the church's help.
How many of the panelists have ministries for those who are suffering from addiction already in your churches or your congregations? And if you do not have ministries, what are the ways that you are going about helping to educate individuals on this subject matter?
Yeah, we have a very active recovery community here at Church of the Resurrection. We call it Resurrection Recovery, and it is open for anybody and everybody. It's not specifically for the Christian faith. It's for anybody of any faith or no faith. We have 14 different support groups that meet here that are some of our groups, and then groups that we welcome from outside the community. Traditional AA, Al-Anon, Codependent Anonymous, Smart Recovery, different groups like that use our facility. We just offer our space. We don't charge any rent or anything like that. And then we also welcome other organizations such as Crossroads and Full Circle to use our facility for their support groups. So it's, to me, it's very, very important to show our church community and to show the recovery community that people are welcome inside the doors of churches, and that they can find help here. And I hope that everybody that walks in here is welcomed with open arms and not judged. It's easy to judge. I judge. But I just think it's really important for church people to interact with people in recovery. Because that Mike said that, just get to know those of us in recovery. We're normal people. I remember the first time I met somebody that said they were a recovering alcoholic. I didn't know what to think. And I look back on that day, and all I would have had to do was ask a little more about his situation, but I was afraid to ask. And I've learned since then that the more we learn about other people's disabilities, addictions, their illnesses, the better we can walk alongside them.
For a number of years, faith traditions have invited Alcoholics Anonymous into their faith establishments for meetings. My experience with that is most of the time it's in the basement. They have a side door. They have to come in, and they're not to be seen by anybody. They're not to be talked to. So as faith leaders, as we really talk about this stigma that has plagued individuals who are suffering from addiction, from getting the help that they need, what do you say about the stigma, and how do we as faith leaders help individuals overcome that stigma? Many of us know, perhaps those of us in recovery know, that asking for help is one of the most difficult things to do. And when it's asking for help from something that is often viewed as a moral failure, it's even more difficult. So how do we as faith leaders make ourselves available and even vulnerable to that individual that's suffering in silence and may not be comfortable coming forward asking for help because of the stigma?
I'll take that, Pastor Darren. I just want to say, first of all, I certainly see what you're saying about, AA meetings being in the basement and we don't want to see them, we don't want to hear them. But respectfully, I think that also AA and all of the 12-step groups put such an importance on anonymity. Absolutely. And I think that if somebody were the president of the board of the directors or the chief pastor of that church, they themselves might have trouble coming into that first meeting. Yes. And I want people to have the courage to be able to go to that first meeting. And I think it's also okay to say to people who are struggling with substance use disorder that you don't have to be the representative for everybody struggling with addiction. Yes. You don't have to be the one who's going out and waving the flag and wearing the T-shirt and speaking to your high school class and going back to your 25th reunion and telling your story at every turn. It's okay to just work on yourself and work on your family, and that's also an okay option. And I'll say that if there are Jewish people who are listening, I just want to acknowledge that it is sometimes hard to go into those rooms. And it's especially hard when the rooms are inside of churches. And even as welcoming as CORE is, CORE is an amazing facility, and Pastor Tom is a fabulous representative, and Pastor Adam opens his doors to the whole community. But in some ways it's foreign, and there's also a difficult history for the Jewish people with Christianity sometimes. And that could be an obstacle for somebody going in. So if there's Jewish people who are watching and listening to this, I just want to say that that feeling is normal and it's okay. And at the same time, there is wisdom in the 12 steps and in other recovery programs that can be translated into ways that is culturally familiar to you. And that's probably true, my guess is, for other non-Christian faiths here in America, because most of these meetings are in churches, and it's said in Christian language, and there's nothing wrong with the Lord's Prayer. It's a beautiful prayer, but if you're not a Christian, it's not your prayer. It's your host's prayer. And so what I would say is to people who are not Christian, seek out the leaders in your faith, seek out brothers and sisters in your faith, and find authentic ways to walk down that path, and you don't need to take on somebody else's language to do that.
Thank you. Very well said, Rabbi David. For my part, Temple Buddhist Center is located inside of Unity Temple in the plaza, and there's an extensive community of both substance use disorder as well as behavioral disorders. So Gamblers Anonymous, sex and love addiction, Overeaters Anonymous, all the various different groups. And so as a leader, a spiritual leader there, to address the stigma, to provide that open door to vulnerability, I think that's why we're leaders. We're not afraid to, as they say in the 12-step programs, to put some skin in the game, to really share with an open heart, which gives, even indirectly, permission for others to reveal themselves. And this is the power of community. This is really the antithesis to the disorder itself, because it's such a person feels so alone, and so then they will find something to escape from that, which then only exacerbates the problem, because then they become more and more alone as they withdraw from the rest of their community. So that is the power of, in the Buddhist practice, it's called Sangha. But it's the power of our spiritual communities to come together, to share with each other. And it's kind of like what Pastor Tom was saying. I think it was Mr. Rogers that said, you cannot hate anyone once you know their story. And so that stigma dissolves, much like what you were saying, as we come to know each other and feel each other's heart and really share and be vulnerable with each other. So I think that's an important factor.
And one of the things the broader community probably needs to be aware of is recovering people are probably some of the best people you want to be around. I've worked in almost every area when it comes to substance use disorder, inpatient, outpatient, outreach, intervention, prevention, detox, just about. And I'll tell you the truth. I'd rather be facilitating a group with addicted people sometimes than dealing with church folks. Because at least they understand they have a problem. When most people going to church are trying to prove to everybody they don't have a problem. Now, we all know that's not true, but the reality is I'd much rather deal with people that understand I have a problem, can you help me with it, give me some tools, give me some, rather than talking to a bunch of people who think they have no problem. They're just doing God a favor by showing up once a week. And that's the difficulty, I think, is that sometimes those individuals never get a chance just because of the stigma of the addiction. And I would say to those who are in the broader society, if somebody really is in recovery, somebody really is working on their issues, they're some of the best employees, they're some of the best family members, they're some of the best friends, some of the best colleagues you could ever have, because they're constantly working on themselves and they understand there's never going to be a time that I'm not working on me. That is always going to be something that I need to work on. And those are the kind of people I love to be around, the people that already know they have a problem and want to get some help for it.
Pastor Tom?
You know what Rabbi David was saying about the very first AA meeting I went to, I drank before because I was so scared. And it was in a church, and I didn't want anybody to see me, and so I appreciate and respect that, because that's how I was. And however, most of our recovery meetings are in our main building, where you have to go into the lobby, and I know that's difficult for some, and we do offer classes that are in the basement, where you can have total anonymity. But one thing that I wanted to try to do is to break that a little bit and say, you can come in our main doors, and you can feel comfortable doing that. And I know that's a tall order for some. I don't know that I could have done that the very first time, but that's one of the things I'm trying to show people is they can come in the main door of our church and use our main meeting rooms. And so there's a balance there, and we try to respect, the position for everybody in that, because I drank before I went to my first meeting. I was so scared to go. And that's why, by the way, probably some AA people don't like this, but I will always welcome anybody into our meetings, no matter what their condition is, when they walk in those doors, because I was one of those.
We want to, again, invite you who are listening on live stream, Facebook Live, or on the YouTube channel to send us some questions. We do have one question that has been given to us, and I'll just pose this to the panel. How can a non-addicted person be helpful to someone that is in active addiction or still suffering? How can a non-addicted person be helpful to a person that is in active addiction, still suffering?
So I'm just thinking about my social worker, who is a certified drug and alcohol abuse counselor, who ends up in my office pretty regularly, just kind of all sorts of worked up. And one of the things that I've learned from her is that as a non-addicted person, it's important to just speak up, to just have a voice and use it, and say, most of the situations that kind of confront me are situations where somebody is actively withdrawing in the hospital and are being under-medicated, under-treated. And just to say, this is not right, and even kind of dig in and say, what are the patterns of behavior among the healthcare community, among society at large, that leads to, and this kind of feeds right into the last question, leads to that stigma, because it really is not just an issue in our faith communities. It's a societal issue. So I think my answer is use my voice.
I just want to say that I want to give a shout out to all of the Anon groups, which are a whole series. People may not be familiar with them, but they're a whole series of 12-step groups that are for the family members of those who are suffering from substance use disorder. And that language is new to me, by the way, like only about 3 weeks old or so, because until about 3 weeks ago, we said addicts. And so Al-Anon is for family members of alcoholics, and Nar-Anon is for family members of narcotic addiction. And one thing that's, and I know there's a lot of different forms of recovery, but in the 12-step world, they often talk about it being a family disease, and that there's stuff to work on yourself, even if you're not the person who is addicted to a substance. And so I went to Al-Anon myself, even though I wasn't addicted to alcohol. But I had a brother who was. And I'll tell you, I was introduced to Al-Anon when I was studying in Jerusalem, and I was in seminary. And so I was in class for, 8, 10, 11 hours a day studying sacred scriptures. And 1 hour a day, 1 hour, one evening, I went to Al-Anon groups. And I learned more about God in that 1 hour with, there were ultra-Orthodox women who had every inch of their skin covered with long skirts and a head covering and sleeves down to her wrists, and guys with tattoos all over themselves and long hair and every walk of life. And the thing that bound us together is that we all were praying deeply for a loved one, a spouse, a child, a parent, a partner, a sibling, and we all learned that, guess what? We weren't perfect, and we were making choices, and we had behaviors that were actually actively harming our loved one. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
I think David hit it right. You know, when people come to me and say, what can I do? How can I help my loved one? I suggest that they do just what David said, and I check into Al-Anon, check into other families. I say call first call for that matter. That's the best. That's a great place to start. Educate yourself, because often, as was said, family members end up being enablers without even knowing it. And so just reach out to support groups to educate yourself a little bit about how to help your loved one. You get in a room full of people in Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, and those are people that have walked in your shoes and can provide you, quite frankly, the best help that you can get, because they've been where you're at, and they'll provide you the hope that you need, that you can get through this, because you really don't have a lot of control over the person that's in their active addiction. You have very little control, if any, but what you do have control over is how you react to it. And so that's usually the best thing that I think people can do when they're baffled with their friend or loved one who's just continually using.
It's a very good question. How does someone who is not in addiction or recovery help someone who is still suffering? And I just wanted to add my little 2 cents to that. I think one of the things that we can do, and Pastor Sarah kind of touched on it, is to use inclusive language. Language is important in so many ways on a number of matters and subjects, and it's no different for addiction. We have moved in this community of recovery from saying clean and sober. Does that suggest that before I was dirty and drunk? So just using inclusive language as a person who's not in recovery or as a person who's not in addiction can really be a support to those who are. Let me continue this conversation with a question. I'm not going to assume, but how many of you have persons in your congregations who have been, currently are, in addiction, or they have moved to recovery? Everyone? I didn't want to make that assumption, so I thought I would ask. So since everyone on the panel has that experience, my question to you is, when you recognize someone that is still suffering from addiction, what's the best approach that a faith leader, if there are other pastors listening in, that you would suggest a person make? If you believe something is awry, you believe that there's someone that has a problem, either because they came to Bible study and smelled of alcohol or worship and that sort of thing, what is the best approach to help someone or try to address that issue?
Tough question. I've been talking too much. But I mean, I think it's, for me, I don't want to put that person on the defensive. And I just try to show a lot of love and grace and mercy for that person because they're hurting. it's hard. I mean, I don't confront them in that situation at that point. I will talk to them at a later point, but I don't ever put somebody in a defensive situation immediately. But I will gently approach them in a non-threatening manner, because for me, I was already defensive on my drinking, and I didn't need anybody telling me that I was drinking or drugging too much. I had to be the one to make that decision, but I do remember people giving me gentle, loving nudges.
I think faith leaders, spiritual leaders, and teachers try always to seek first to understand. And so I like gentle, loving nudges through questions, never anything public. It would be, for me, it would be a casual aside or a text or an email, which is just an open invitation, because, again, if they're not ready, if they're not ripe, then no amount of pushing or shoving is going to make a difference. So just to be that loving, open presence that is always there and always inviting, and just so they know that. But at the same time, also boundaries. As faith leaders, sometimes those really painful discussions, you are not invited back until you have an opportunity to speak with me about what's going on. The door's open between you and I, but you cannot come in that state. So that could be very hard, very painful, but it also might be exactly what's needed. So as faith leaders, we try to sense that, try to feel into it.
I think that also how we plan our social events. I know that some faith traditions don't have drinking as part of their socializing. In the Jewish community, we don't demonize drinking, and we also, and we don't demonize the person who, in fact, we sanctify every Sabbath meal with wine. And we have some holidays where it's very common for people to drink, and sometimes drink to excess. Now, we don't drink to excess all the time, but that does exist. But I think that one of the ways to make an inclusive community is we always make sure that there's grape juice. When I have people over at my house and I sanctify the Sabbath meal, instead of using wine, even though I drink, I always sanctify it over grape juice so that everybody can partake of the cup of blessing that I'm using. In the same way that we haven't had food in our synagogue in like 17 months, but I'm assuming that we'll be able to break bread together one day, and sometimes that bread needs to be gluten-free. I also have celiacs that are in my synagogue. Yeah. We have people with anaphylactic nut allergies, so we have a rule for our caterers that you can't put out a dish with nuts without putting right there on the buffet table includes nuts. Now, there's no moral failure on someone because they can't eat nuts, right? Yes. They have an allergy. That's right. And there's no moral failure if you can't drink, and I think that that's a way to normalize it, and again, treat it as an ailment.
Rabbi Glickman, you just kind of took us in the direction that I really hoped that we would go, and that is there are those faith traditions where alcohol is a part of the celebratory act of worship.
I want to add that for someone in recovery, that can make it hard to come back to a house of worship. Yeah. And I recognize that.
I experienced that, and I won't mention the denomination, but I went and took communion assuming it was grape juice, because that's what our denomination, and I drank it and it was wine. And, I'll never go back there. There was no other option. So you got to be really careful.
There are faith leaders also that don't understand substance use disorder. My brother of blessed memory went to study with one rabbi who did a lot of drinking and tried to convince him to drink with him at a celebration, that this was a holy act. Yes. And he had to advocate for himself with a rabbi and say, no, you don't understand. I cannot drink.
See, this is now we're getting into it. This is the conversation I wanted to have. No, this is the real talk that helps people get into recovery and the help that they need. And so I'm thankful that you brought that out, Rabbi Glickman. And so for this subject that we're currently on, in those faith traditions where alcohol is a part of the ritual or the celebratory act of worship, for those individuals in recovery, it is imperative that the faith leaders understand addiction in more than just a surface way, but a more in-depth way to assist those, as you have done with the substitution of the grape juice. I'll tell you just real quickly, I was invited to worship, and Pastor Sarah, it was a Lutheran church, and I was just expecting to have grape juice when I took the Lord's Supper, and it was not. It was wine. And I just remember how my throat burned, and I just coughed a little bit. And I looked to the person I was a guest with, and they looked at me and like, what? This is what we do. And so in those instances, as faith leaders, we have to be cognizant of those who are parishioners in our congregations, particularly those individuals that may be trying to get into recovery.
And I'm not trying to add anything to first calls of responsibilities, but I think that may be one avenue or one bit of advocacy maybe we could do would be to ask the denominations to start being more sensitive to that. There are seminarians coming out of school every year, and they're going to be young and ambitious and going to lead churches and have no idea, again, what they're going to face. Maybe some letter writing campaigns to some of the denominations to suggest to them that, especially for the ones, again, that do use alcohol and when they're doing communion and things like that, just to have an alternative for people that may. I don't think that's asking too much. And I would think normal, God-fearing people would want to do the right thing. Right? Yeah, right.
I would go so far as it's not just have it as an option. It's having it as an honored option. You know, like, I'll give you an example. We had like every other house of worship in the world, we had to pivot and start doing programming on Zoom. And so we did an event for the holiday of Sukkot, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. And we had a mixologist. And it was for young adults. Each drink that she made a cocktail and a mocktail, and she gave this whole speech as part of the program. She says, I want everybody to feel that they are having a sensory experience and that this is something special and a treat that they are coming to in my home. And, you know, it's not that on the side you'll order club soda with a lemon in it, you know, and hope that nobody notices the difference. But there's no shame, and this is just on the menu with everything else.
You know, we're touching on a number of subjects, and I think this conversation is great. Let's continue with one of the things that was mentioned earlier. I think Pastor Tom may have mentioned it in one of his responses, and that is that subject of enabling. Some would say there's a thin line between enabling someone and helping someone. Who would care to speak to that? This is a question from our online viewing audience. What is enabling a person who is in active addiction?
The phrase I like to use when I was counseling people or counseling with families is, you're going to love them to death, because they suggest that they're doing it out of love. Well, if your love is continuing them to actively be involved in their addiction, and we all know what the end result of addiction is, it's either death or jail in most instances. If you love them enough to lead them in a different direction. And enabling simply suggests that you know exactly what's going on, and you turn a blind eye to it. You keep providing funds, you keep providing excuses, keep providing resources to a person that you know is actively in addiction. And the other thing that probably needs to be talked about is there are a lot of very high-performing addicts who high functioning that you on a normal day looks like the normal person you go to work with every day, but when they get off work, and I've had this experience over and over again, there were people that would get off work at 5 and drink all night, sleep a couple of hours, and come to work the next morning. You would never even know they were drinking. Because they've been doing it so long, they've established this, tolerance to the drug or the alcohol. So in instances where enabling is the issue, you just have to really be honest with yourself. Are you helping the person, or are you hurting the person? And if they're continuing to use what you give them to stay in their addiction, there's a good chance you're hurting them more than you're helping.
I was looking to see if anyone else wanted to speak to that. That's a great answer. Nothing else to say about that. As we talk about addiction, it seems that our subject has focused on adults. But we know that addiction doesn't just affect adults. There are young people who are suffering from addictions. And as faith leaders, Rabbi Glickman has already talked about Al-Anon, and I don't know if you said Alateen, but these are some of the programs that are helpful for individuals that have a teen that is in addiction. But what do we do as faith leaders when we come across a teen that is in active addiction?
For me, I try to steer them towards other teens who are in recovery. My experience with teens is they don't want to listen to adults. I know I wouldn't have wanted to, but there are teens and young people in their early 20s that are out there with long-term sobriety, and that's where I put a plug in for like Full Circle or Crossroads, or we have a young adult support group here, but there's more than you think. There's some of the AA programs around have young adult groups, but for me, I meet with young people, and they're just doing it to get the heat off from their parents, in my opinion. But I have several young people in my phone that have told me I can give them their phone numbers, and that seems to work better than anything else for me.
I think that one thing that we haven't really talked about tonight is mental illness generally. And I think that, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but, there are, as Pastor Brooks was talking about, there are people who, they can drink, they can get high, they can do it recreationally, they don't become addicted, or they can stay fully functional. There's other people who it knocks them on their behind, and it's for the person who has substance use disorder that can sometimes feel like life is grossly unfair, that that's the case. But oftentimes, when does it begin? It begins with self-medication for other underlying mental health conditions. And I think that one thing when dealing with teens is not only taking away the stigma of substance use disorder specifically, but mental health issues generally. So there's a huge rise of depression and anxiety, other mental health issues in teens today, and especially during the pandemic. And I think that we have to really take away the stigma of mental health and mental illness generally for teens. And with that, I think will come, and that goes to some of the stuff that Victor was talking about, some of the underlying issues.
So tonight we have began the conversation because certainly this is just a beginning. My hope is that the conversation will continue. We've talked about addiction and how it is a disease. We have also talked about the stigma that sometimes comes with a person suffering from addiction. We have talked about a number of different topics, but what we haven't talked about yet, and I want to get to before our time is up, is recovery. On the other side of addiction, if individuals get into help and find supportive people who don't judge them and who encourage and support them, there is recovery. How, and let me put it this way, what gift, as faith leaders on this panel, are you willing to offer or give to your congregations? What gifts of recovery are you willing to give to your congregations so that they can get the help that they need?
I think for me, it's the gift of meeting them where they are. And of saying, this is who you are at this moment in time, and this is where you find yourself in your life, and how can I walk with you?
Thank you for that. And also, one of the things that I try to share with our community is that it's sort of a relaxing into the process. Recovery, in some cases, could be a lifelong process. It's not a destination. It is a day-by-day, moment-by-moment embracing of what's true in this moment, what's real right now. Well, right now, I want to drink. And so you just become aware of that craving and that desire, but realize that as most traditions teach, this idea of, this too shall pass. And so relaxing into, it's an easing into the whole process of recovery itself.
And I think the 12 steps suggest that you can't do this by yourself. And I think that's why it's so important that the faith communities, regardless of what your faith is, it's so important that we help people understand that in the 35 years of doing this, the difference between the people that are successful in recovery and the ones that end up going back out are the ones that have a really good idea of who God is and who's going to help them through this. Whoever you suggest God is, and this is certainly not trying to make everybody Christian or Muslim or whatever the case may be, but understand that you're going to need somebody bigger than you to make it. And then recovery is about you becoming this new person that you don't even know. And so you're constantly learning things about yourselves, and that can be exciting if we present it the right way. You know who the old person was. How about spend some time getting to know who this new person is, the real you. And in some days, you're even going to surprise yourself.
I would say if you are a pastor and you don't know somebody in recovery, you should get to know somebody. Because what those of us that are in recovery and people in the faith community can share is hope. There is hope. Because when you're talking to somebody active in their addiction, that have the courage to come in to see you, they don't have much hope. And the not doing it alone, and it doesn't have to be a 12-step program. I mean, I want to put a plug in for Smart Recovery. Smart Recovery is not a faith-based higher power program. It's a cognitive program. So those people that are frustrated with the faith community, there are other options out there, but not doing it alone is so critical.
So tonight, just to reiterate for our viewers, we have someone from the Methodist tradition, we have someone from the Buddhist tradition, we have someone from the Jewish tradition, we have someone from the Lutheran tradition, we have someone from the non-denominational tradition, and we have someone from the Baptist tradition. Our last question from our viewers is simply this: how do we, who may have different beliefs in God, maybe even different beliefs in who God is, work together to support people in 12-step recovery programs? How do all of us, who may have varying beliefs in who God is, come together to work with and support those who are in 12-step programs? Okay, I'll say something. I think tonight is an example of that. We're doing it right now. We made it intentional to invite people from different faith traditions to have this conversation. And I am hopeful that those who are viewing us see a group of people with different faiths coming together around this cause to help individuals who may still be suffering and to also support those who are in recovery already. So this is one way. Can anyone speak to others?
Back to just using our voices and just speaking out into the community and saying this is substance abuse disorder is real and is an issue, and to use our platforms and work together.
I would also put out to help organizations like First Call. I mean, First Call casts a very wide net. And the more that schools, faith communities, other organizations can help sort of what I will call common space organizations like First Call that can't be, cubbyholed into one faith tradition or one church, where we put ourselves there and make those personal connections, whether it's with their counselors or their staff, as well as other spaces like public schools or parochial schools or private schools and places where teens are, and let them know that, hey, we're resources, we're not here to proselytize, but, you have a kid or you have a family in your school or at your community center, we're here. And, in the Jewish community, we also have spaces like, Jewish Family Services, which is a counseling service, and it's open to people who are of the Jewish faith, people who are not of the Jewish faith. I know that the Catholic Charities also has, all sorts of what I will call non-church-based counseling programs. I think that we have to make ourselves resources to those spaces.
Darren, I like what you said. I got to meet Rabbi Glickman. We did a funeral together, a multi-faith funeral together, and so we become friends. And I learned when, I think of 12-step programs as being, power of your understanding. It can be whatever you want it to be. I never even thought that it had a slant towards the Christian faith to it. But when he said that to me one time, I thought, I really took that to heart, and it's like, I see that, And so I think the idea of us coming together from different backgrounds, different faiths. I learned that from David because he was open and shared that, and I think that's really important for us in the faith community to learn more about our brothers and sisters from different backgrounds and be respectful for their beliefs and try to adapt and understand it more.
And that's what I would say. We just have to respect each other's differences, isn't it? Well, I mean, I don't want to make it simple, but isn't it just that simple? I don't have to believe the way you believe or think the way you think to respect how you think. And just like we would accept anybody coming to us for help, I think we also have to accept however they choose to get the help, respect that. If that's working for them, then why would we speak against it? But certainly, maybe First Call could contract all of us and we can take this on the road and just take it around to all the churches in Kansas City. Well, okay. I've been known to dream too big sometimes, but certainly this can't be the last time. We've got to do this again. If for nothing else, even if it's just one person that watched and decide they're going to get themselves off drugs or alcohol, or some pastor who's going to be more compassionate, or some church member who interacts with a family member that has some better ideas. There's tons of things. Again, this could last 3 or 4 hours, but I respect everybody up here, and I think if we all just simply respected each other's differences, we can get a whole lot done.
Well, with those remarks, Reverend Brooks, it is time for us to do our closing statements. As you said, this could go on, because I have a lot more questions to ask you guys and ladies. But we have scheduled this for a certain time, and so at this time, please take about 1 minute and give us a closing statement. However you want to do that. And we'll start with Pastor Sarah.
All right. Well, I just want to say again, thank you to First Call for organizing this. And it was really a pleasure and an honor to be up here with the rest of you. And I learned a lot tonight. So thank you.
Rabbi Glickman?
Thank you very much, First Call, for creating this space. Thank you, CORE, for opening up your walls to all of us. And for those who are out there listening, whether you're a family member, whether you're an active user who's seeking help, and you haven't been able to find that space know that there's a lot of help out there. And you're not alone. There's somebody else just like you, or at least similar enough to you, to be able to walk with you on the journey.
Victor?
Again, thank you to CORE and to everyone for having us. For those of you that are interested, Temple Buddhist Center has a Buddhism in 12-step as well as a refuge recovery program. And so these are open and available to all forms of disorder, substance use, as well as behavioral. So you're always invited. The door is always open, and our hearts are always open. And as Rabbi David said so well, there is a tremendous wealth of opportunities for people to find help, to find a hand to hold, for someone to listen. And so it just takes a little tiny effort to reach out, and those opportunities are out there. So our invitation is to please come and join us in conversation, discussion on this road to recovery.
Pastor Brooks?
Words of one of my favorite songs. If you've fallen by the wayside of life, your dreams and visions have been shattered, you're all broken inside. You don't have to stay in the shape that you're in, because the potter wants to put you back together again. If you need some help, go get some help. It's the bravest thing you can do. And if somebody comes to you for help, love them just the way they are, but love them too much to let them stay that way.
And last but not least, our illustrious and gracious host, Pastor Tom.
Thank you. Well, thank you, First Call. And I just, I want to go back to hope. There is hope. It is a disease. It's nothing to be ashamed of, although most of us are. It's nothing we have to hide from, be it a family member or the person in their addiction. And, I was filled with shame and guilt and remorse, like most everybody that walks into the door of recovery. And what I learned right off the bat was that I wasn't alone, it's been said. And, there is help. My higher power welcomes any, that's who he hung around with, was addicts and alcoholics. And so I just think, for us faith leaders, we need to really understand that this is a disease and it's not a moral issue. Granted, we can head down. We make some decisions that are not good moral decisions, but the disease itself, it's a disease, and it's just not something to be ashamed of. And there is hope. There's just hope. That's what I want everybody to take away. Thanks.
Addiction, if you'll recall, is giving up everything for one thing. Recovery is giving up that one thing for everything. At this time, we're going to turn it over to Bethany for some remarks.
Good evening. My name is Bethany Depew, recovery advocate and part of the clinical team at First Call of Kansas City. I just want to thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and everyone that was able to log in and tune in and listen in. It's really, I think, been a very healing experience. I can personally attest to that. I've heard some things I even needed to hear this evening. I also want to be transparent myself. I'm not only a professional in the recovery community, but I'm an individual in long-term recovery from drugs and alcohol, and have also been active in my faith community from the age of 2. I'm a preacher kid, and so it's been an integral part of my recovery to have a supportive faith community, but also have conversations such as this, where we lean in and have difficult conversations, because that's how we recover. So thank you. I want to take a few moments. I know we've taken a lot of your time this evening, but I want to take a few more minutes to kind of flesh out and explain a little bit more and highlight some of the language that was alluded to this evening. We call it trauma-informed language, not necessarily due to the fact that someone has experienced trauma, but it is to be sensitive to the fact that the individuals we're talking about, many of these experiences have been traumatic, whether it be physical, emotional, sexual abuse in their past, or the traumas experienced during their active use. It's very important. We know that words can hurt, and we're here to support and help these individuals. So if we can cut to that graphic, this will be available on our website to download. Please feel free to print and hang up in your place of worship, in wherever it would be helpful. Please feel free to print and use. So we just wanted to highlight some supportive language and some stigmatizing, unhelpful language as well. Many of these are still commonly used. That doesn't make them helpful. It just means that they're commonly used. One in particular that I would like to highlight, and has been highlighted over and over again, is that this is a disease. This is not a moral issue. Substance use disorder is a disease. Many of us have come in contact with friends and family members struggling with other diseases, such as cancer. That treatment isn't stigmatized or looked down upon. Peanut allergies were brought up. I love that. These are diseases. This isn't a moral failing. We are not good or bad dependent upon our substance use. And I think that's really important for many of us seeking recovery, and those that support those in recovery. An addict, using addiction as a noun really makes a person, we like to use person-centered language, so a person with substance use disorder rather than an addict, a junkie, an alcoholic. If somebody identifies themselves as that, that's fine, but it's not our place to identify them as such. I think it's also helpful when we talk about what is brought up this evening about clean and dirty, but to bring up positive for a substance or dependent upon a substance. And I think just something that's important for me to remember is we are human. We will continually educate ourselves on this. We will be open to understand and to make mistakes. I know that in conversations preparing for this event, many individuals were afraid of using stigmatizing language. We will continue to make mistakes. What's most important is to have these conversations, to apologize, and to ask somebody's preference if they're in your faith community or in your family or a friend. So I just want to thank everyone again, and please, if you are seeking recovery, if you're seeking resources, all of what we've talked about this evening is on our website, and I'm going to read it so I don't say this incorrectly, but it's firstcallkc.org/faith and addiction. You can download that PDF, and we have our main 24/7 crisis line is 816-361-5900. Thank you all so much, and I'll turn it back over to Darren.
All right, thank you, Bethany, for that information. And I again want to thank our panelists for a great conversation tonight. Such great respect for everyone on the panel and your individual ministries that you're involved in. It's my task to close us in prayer. And if you all would allow, I would like to do that in the faith tradition that I am comfortable with. And I will do that by reciting and praying the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. God bless you, and thank you for tuning in with us tonight.